I'm going to, of course, continue with talking about the rest of the Tudor dynasty today and try to wrap that up. And then I will be moving to talk about, what is with that today? I'm going to talk about the Stewart Dynasty as well. And I probably will get up to at least to the English Civil War and talk about that. So that's kind of what I'm planning to do today, is to talk about, of course, these two topics overall. So anyway, good morning out. Looks like Emily, of course, is on Facebook right now. I don't think anybody else is on there right now. I've got one person on there right now. Q Lee, of course, is on StreamYard. So there's plenty of room if you want to, of course, come into StreamYard right now. There's the link, of course, on the bottom. So, let me know if you have any questions, of course, later about, of course, the lecture today. And I'll later, of course, be posting this video lecture up onto my YouTube channel. Just not sure what the deal with the green screen is today, but it's looked like it's a little off today. I think it's the shirt I'm wearing. I think is what it is. But anyway, so a few reminders before we get started. I do have I want to show you a few things on here which are important today. Let me see if I can bring it up real quick. Actually, there's two new announcements I need to show you today, which are kind of important. Of course, the first thing I need to talk about is your first exam is still up. I don't know if anybody has not, of course, finished it yet, but it is still open. I think I did leave it open for like a couple days if you need it still, like if you haven't completed it yet, basically. So yeah, it's still open in quizzes. So, try to get that done as best you can if you haven't done it yet. Also, there's another announcement too I've got as well. Talk about in quizzes. Let's see here. Well, there's two announcements, actually. There should be that video quiz still up, the one on Sir Isaac Newton. I've been kind of sending reminders out about that to you, but that one's still up right now. If you, of course, want to finish that one, so to try to get that one done. So I think I moved it back a couple days. So it should be open until like the weekend. Actually, I might leave it a little open a little longer than that because I've got that makeup day, I know, next week. But it's going to be due this week, I know. Try to get it done, of course, for that purpose. But I might leave it open because of the makeup day next week also coming up. I forgot about that, which I'll also kind of talk about today a little bit later, maybe at the end of this lecture. Of course, there is a new assignment I posted, of course, today, which is the Scientific Revolution Enlightenment Canvas Quiz. So that's going to be posted in quizzes. That's going to be due, of course, next Thursday. Might leave it a little open also next week as well. But that's for the two lectures I did on the Scientific Revolution and the Age of Enlightenment. So try to check that out and get that done as well. But I have the two lectures on the bottom, which are right here. I think part of the second lecture is only like half of it. So it's like only like about an hour and a half, I think, or so of lecture on that period. But those are the two PowerPoint, the two YouTube lectures I got posted right now on my channel. And I've got the PowerPoint lecture, of course, right here also to look at as well. So check that out. That one does have 15 questions with it. Same kind of format pretty much as the other topics we've talked about before. All right, so I'm going to move on. Of course, I'm going to talk about next. Of course, I had that little slide you saw, of course, on Shakespeare that you just saw right there. Take that off the screen. Yeah, Shakespeare, they kind of went into pretty much most of what we need to talk about today about William Shakespeare. And then I will be moving on, of course, like I said, to talk about the Tudors, Tudor Dynasty, at least the end of the Tudor Dynasty with Elizabeth's reign, because that's where we're at right now. Then I'll move to talk about the Stewart Dynasty, hopefully at least up to the English Civil War today. But Shakespeare, yeah, greatest playwright, period, in any language, not just English, but pretty much any language overall. Shakespeare had something like 38 plays, I think, that he wrote in his lifetime. Well, he lived to be 52, so he died young. So I imagine if he lived, another 15, 20 years, he could have written way more plays. And most of his plays were written at the end of Elizabeth's reign and then at the beginning of James's reign, rulers of England. And of course, he was famous for his Globe Theater, which was founded around 1599. Actually, there were two Globe Theaters. I don't know if you know this or not, but the first one burned down. And then later they had another one. And then that one, I think, was closed later by the Puritans. I think when Oliver Cromwell came in and all that, I think that was much later after he was dead. But the Globe Theater continued onward after he died, where they kept, putting on these plays. So his plays, the ones that were famous, I think I've got a slide showing you the plays that he had. Those are some of the big ones that he was well known for: Romeo and Juliet, Merchant of Venice, Julius Caesar, Midsummer's Night's Dream, Henry IV, Henry V. He's got one called Richard III. He's got one on Henry VIII, Much Ado About Nothing, Twelfth Night, Hamlet, and more. I think he was in the middle of, there was a play going on, Henry VIII, I think is the play, I believe. They had a fire broke out and burned down the actual original Globe Theater, and they built another one, of course, later. Also, you can see, he wrote love sonnets and stuff like that, 154, which I don't know if you know, but he was married, like I said, to Anne Hathaway, but there was theories that he was bisexual, and some of the plays may have been actually written for a man. Yeah, that's true about that. So interesting. Pretty much in his plays, like with the female parts, all the parts were played by men. So even the men would play the women, stuff like that. And that's typical of what kind of plays that they did a long time ago. But his plays were interesting because they were more modernized type plays, all pretty much in vernacular, like in English. And they went away from the old medieval type plays, which were, I think, more based on religion. So his is based on, like, history and various events in, English history and even European history, like Julius Caesar or whatever, as examples. So I think these might be his most, Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, Macbeth, and I think those three are the most famous ones he did. Maybe Julius Caesar, maybe he's famous too, but I know those first three in that list right there are considered the most famous ones. All right, let me go ahead and move on, of course. And of course, I'm going to continue talking about the Tudor Dynasty. Again, of course, we're going to finish that up today. Then I'll, of course, move on to talk about the Stewart Dynasty that comes in after Elizabeth's reign. We didn't talk about all the things about Elizabeth I wanted to talk about. I kind of started talking about how Elizabeth was a virgin queen in all of this. And she never married. She never took a husband. She didn't have a consort, which, is kind of rare, usually back then, even, long time ago. There were some men that tried to marry her, if you know about this. Of course, the King of Spain, who had been previously Elizabeth's, brother-in-law, married to Mary, Bloody Mary, came over from Spain and tried to court her, try to, marry her. That didn't work out because, Spain was Catholic and, England was going Protestant. Philip was kind of involved in the Counter-Reformation, so that never really worked out, of course. So she never really wanted to marry him. I think she flirted with the idea, but it never worked out. That was more to the early part of her reign, when that happened. Then there was also, they say, her court favorite was Sir Robert Dudley, who was known as the Earl of Leicester. And Dudley was a really good-looking guy, looked great on a horse, Robert Dudley. Anyway, the only problem with Dudley he had, if you know about this, Dudley was married. He had a wife, So it's like couldn't marry him. I mean, because of that, because of her. But she was ill, and they thought she was going to die soon. And the story about it, all of a sudden, his wife fell down some stairs and died mysteriously. Maybe she was pushed. I don't know. So there was talk of maybe them marrying, but I think it was kind of too controversial because she had, fallen down the stairs and all of that. And so, yeah, they never married at all, and she, of course, stayed the so-called virgin queen, after that forever, with the so-called Tudor dynasty that, of course, was there. So anyway, so that's just kind of a little bit about, her and her attempts to maybe marry, and so that pretty much is going to seal her deal with, the throne going to Mary Stuart's side of the family, going to eventually her son, James VI of Scotland, who's the ruler, currently there. Of course, we've already talked about the fact that she killed off her first cousin, Mary Stuart. All right, let me go ahead and move on next. Now, of course, the other big thing that marked, I guess, especially the end of Elizabeth's reign, was the conflicts that she had with Spain, that she had. Well, Philip II, and of course, Philip II, I told you was involved in the Counter-Reformation and all of this. He, of course, was if you remember correctly about Philip II, he was the son of, remember, Charles V, who had been the Holy Roman Emperor, King of Spain, either called Charles I or Carlos I. So, yeah, he became the biggest enemy of Queen Elizabeth's reign at this time. This is starting, especially in the 1580s, after he came to the throne. And the two sides eventually got into a conflict that's called different names, but it's usually called either the Anglo-Spanish conflict, or common name it's called is Anglo-Spanish War, 1485 to 1604. And so both those sides fought for control over the Atlantic Ocean, English Channel area, in western parts of Europe. And the Spanish were really concerned about, setting up colonies they were doing in the New World. They're also worried about the area around the Netherlands, because I think the English kind of wanted to take over that area. And so one of the things that Elizabeth started doing during her reign, of course, she started secretly encouraging English privateers to attack the Spanish, mostly in the Atlantic. And of course, the Spanish were bringing up these treasure ships, the famous galleon ships of Spain, those multi-deck ships, which were being used to ship all the gold and silver they had plundered from the New World. And English privateers that sailed these ships were given letters of marque. They were kind of like pirates, at least in the Spanish perspective, and they were called sea dogs. That's the nickname that they were dubbed. And of course, one of the most famous sea dogs, if you ever heard of course, dealing with this period, is Sir Francis Drake. Drake, of course, very well known. Of course, there's several sea dogs that were very famous, not just Drake. I will mention some other ones too that were famous besides Drake, which, of course, Sir Walter Raleigh. I think Sir Walter Raleigh might be one of the most famous sea dogs, of course, besides Drake. Sir John Hawkins, who was one of the main sailors that would lead the English fleet against the Spanish Navy in the attack of the Spanish Armada, which happened in 1588. Sir Humphrey Gilbert also was also famous. He was a half brother of Sir Walter Raleigh. He was known for explorations in part of the New World. Sir Walter Raleigh was also involved in exploring America. He's the one that named Virginia where it is in the eastern coast of the United States after Elizabeth I. But yeah, Drake is the most famous. The Spanish gave him a nickname, which is the Dragon, which I believe in Spanish they called him El Draque, because Drake, when he would attack the Spanish fleets, he would burn a lot of their ships, steal their gold, and so that's where he got the name the Dragon. And One of the things that Drake is very known for is his circumnavigation of the world. He did that 1577 to 1580. This was actually part of a actual planned expedition by the English. They were trying to explore the world itself and find out more about it, and also find out places, I guess, where they could maybe explore and settle. And so Drake set sail like 5 ships. But he had like 90-something men or something involved in the expedition. And of course, his most famous ship that went around the world, that you may have heard of, is the famous Golden Hein, which you see here, which is a type of English galleon ship, which became notorious around that time. It was like, I think one of the very few ships that actually survived the expedition around the world. And Drake was actually one of the first successful men to actually go around the world and come back and not die. That's one thing about Magellan that's very famous, is that Magellan only made it halfway around the world. He died. I think it was, remember I told you, Juan Sebastian Elcano brought him back. But Drake, led this expedition from the beginning to the end, which took almost 3 years. And of course, as he went around the world, he attacked Spanish ships, seized all their gold and silver, and he came back with, I think, what is equivalent to several $1 million worth of gold and silver, which he gave, I think, part of that amount to Elizabeth, who later knighted Drake, and that's why he's now called Sir Francis Drake afterwards. So, but Drake was also involved too in the defeat of the Spanish Armada. He was really considered one of the greatest sailors at the time under the English. And so, yeah, he was definitely considered one of the greatest sea dogs at the time under Elizabeth. Him and probably Sir John Hawkins, you put him in there too. Right. Then the other thing that happened, of course, under the Spanish, of course, was, Philip, like I said, had enough of Elizabeth and England, because England was, still Protestant at that time. And so what, of course, happened 1588 was you had the famous attack of the Spanish Armada, which happened about July, August. I got the wrong date there for some reason. And it was in 1588, excuse me. And 1588. Of course, Philip, what happened was he amassed this huge armada in the summer of 1588, one of the largest armadas ever amassed, I think, until I want to say D-Day, 1944. And Philip caught the Invincible Armada, which was about 130 ships in it. It had about 8,000 sailors. It also had a army he brought over that had about, I want to say, about 30,000 troops in it. So he was going to bring over not just, a fleet, he was going to bring over forces. And of course, the plan was to invade England, topple the government, I guess take over and make England a Catholic state. So I think that was his point of what he was going to try to do there. I think initially he had wanted Mary Stuart to be put on the throne, but she was dead. So I'm guessing he was trying to basically do that, take over England. And what happened was this massive fleet entered the English Channel, and of course they did battle with the English Navy, which was kind of a fledgling navy at the time, which Henry VIII had formed just prior to this, Elizabeth taking power. And the most strategic battle of the whole conflict was in July of 1588. They fought what is called the Battle of Gravelines, it was called. The Battle of Gravelines was considered to be really the most famous battle associated with the attack of the Spanish Armada. The Spanish had better ships. They were larger, more powerful, but the weather kind of played a role. If you study about the defeat of the Spanish Armada, and of course, bad storms affected the weather. The English also talk about later how the weather vane was kind of blowing in the right direction for them. And the English were able to sink some of their ships and capture them. And then what happened was the Spanish fleet, to escape the English and the bad weather, sailed up into the North Sea. And if you look at this map here that I've got to show you, the Spanish had to basically sail up through the North Sea and then around Scotland and Ireland. So they ended up losing like more than half their fleet trying to get back to Spain. I think if you look at the statistics on the battle, they ended up losing, I think 15 ships were captured by the English, somewhere around there, and then 40 or 50 were lost. So they lost like at least 60, 70 ships, maybe more. So the defeat of the Spanish Armada was a total disaster. If you study about what happened with the Spanish, this is a total defeat, and they do think that the defeat of the Spanish Armada was a major turning point in European history, because after that, what happened was Spain started declining, and then England started rising as a power. And it's going to allow England to start colonizing right afterwards. So a lot of people think this is kind of like almost like the beginning of the British Empire, kind of starting like between the Tudors and the Stuart dynasties. And so that's basically, what ends up happening later. You'll see the rise of the British Empire, which will follow. Now, Elizabeth would reign till she was 69. She, of course, would die March 1603. Still, I guess, a virgin queen, if you want to call it that. Of course, that was the big question, who should get the throne? Of course, everybody knew who was going to get the throne, of course, which was Mary, Queen of Scots' son, who was reigning, of course, in Scotland. He, of course, even knew it pretty much. He had been reigning since the 1560s. So James VI of Scotland came over after Elizabeth died. He becomes the King of England. And so this basically is where the Stewart Dynasty is going to take over, and they're going to rule over England, Scotland, also Wales and Ireland. That's going to be later dubbed the so-called United Kingdom of Great Britain, as they call it. And that's actually a nickname, I think, or kind of a name that supposedly King James came up with, the term Great Britain. And so James is the first ruler of Great Britain, the UK, as of course we call it, of course, later. So you kind of got this new baby born, with the fact that these two kingdoms are kind of merged together because Elizabeth died without an heir. So that ends the Stuart Dynasty, that pretty much. Now, let me spend a few minutes reviewing, of course, on what we talked about, of course, with that period. Then I will be, of course, moving on to talk for a few minutes, I guess, about the Stuart Dynasty. We'll kind of start on that today. I probably won't be able to get too far on the Stuart Dynasty, but I'll please talk about maybe the first two kings, King James I, and of course his son Charles I. But yeah, let me go ahead and talk about that. Of course, the review from what we already talked about. So yeah, who was the founder of the Tudor Dynasty? We just talked about that. That was King Henry VII, also called Henry Tudor. And of course, remember correctly, Henry Tudor was the one that seized power at the end of the War of the Roses. Who were some famous rulers of the Tudor Dynasty? You got Henry VIII, after Henry VII. You got his son, Edward VI. You got Mary I, later called Bloody Mary, and then Elizabeth I. Why did Henry VIII start the English Reformation? He began it because Henry wanted to annul his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon, because she had only given him like really one daughter, which was Mary I. And so he wanted to remarry again and maybe have a male heir. So the church he formed, of course, which was in the 1530s, was the Anglican Church. So the Church of England, which will start out as kind of like a quasi-Catholic church ruled by Henry, but eventually become Protestant by the time of Edward VI's reign. What children did he have with his first three wives? His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, I told you, had Mary the First. Anne Boleyn, the second wife, had Elizabeth the First. And then you had Jane Seymour, third wife, had Edward the Sixth. He had two wives executed, of course. Those, of course, are Anne Boleyn, of course, and then later Catherine Howard. Who were his last three wives? Anne of Cleves, I told you. Catherine Howard, who was executed, and his last wife, the sixth wife, of course, is Catherine Parr. What religious changes occurred under Edward VI? Edward VI is the one that changed the Anglican Church to become Protestant, mostly influenced by Calvinism. And Edward himself, of course, kind of converted to being a Protestant ruler. So Edward was the first Protestant king of England. It's under him that the Book of Common Prayer was developed, which was written by Thomas Cranmer mostly. What was Mary Stuart famous for as Queen of England? Mary, of course, was famous for a counter-reformation where she took over the throne from Mary Jane Grey, who tried to seize power. And she got the nickname Bloody Mary because of her persecutions of Protestants in England. She burned people at the stake and imprisoned people because they were Protestant, and even killed one of their archbishops, which of course was Thomas Cranmer. Mary Tudor actually closed the Anglican Church, shut it down. What rebellion broke out in England because Queen I married a Spanish prince who was later the future king of Spain? That was Wyatt's rebellion. Sir Thomas Wyatt led it. This was a rebellion against Mary because they didn't want Prince Philip, the Crown Prince of Spain, to take power, but she killed off Wyatt and crushed the rebellion. Who was the last Tudor ruler? Last Tudor ruler, of course, was Queen Elizabeth I. She was called all kinds of nicknames. Most common name was the Virgin Queen, but people called her Gloriana, or also Good Queen Bess. Was another nickname that Elizabeth was called. What was the Elizabeth religious settlement? It was basically where, using Parliament, Elizabeth reestablished the Anglican Church, and she began to make reforms to it internally. And of course, that included the act of, I think it had a bunch of things. Act of settlement, I think it was, wasn't it? Act of settlement, I believe, was one of them. Let me check that. I think that was what they called it, right? The act of settlement. Act of supremacy in 1559 was the first thing. She, of course, was associated with that. That made Elizabeth the head of this church, Anglican Church, in the state. And then also it made her, it gave her a new title, which was Supreme Governor, which replaced the old one of Supreme Head. Then they had the Act of Uniformity, another one I mentioned, 1559. That one, what it did was it made the Book of Common Prayer the state prayer book of the Anglican Church, and also made it the state church officially, forcing people to go to that church. So yeah, Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity were the two main acts passed by Parliament that were part of the Elizabethan religious settlement. Who was Elizabeth's cousin in Scotland? Many Catholics wanted her to take the throne in England. That was Mary, Queen of Scots, of course, who was briefly Queen of Scotland for so many years. She was her first cousin, and she later was forced out due to a scandal over a reign due to her second husband murdered. And she later fled to Scotland. Later fled from Scotland to England, where Elizabeth eventually put her pretty much in prison, and later killed her. Who were sea dogs that were used by Elizabeth, which we just talked about? Those, of course, were famous English privateers that were used to attack the Spanish, to neutralize them in the Atlantic, etc. Who was the most famous sea dog? That was Sir Francis Drake. And Drake was later often nicknamed names like the Dragon, or I guess the Spanish name was El Drake. What ship did Drake circumnavigate the world, which is what he's famous for, 1577 to 1580? I just talked about that. Drake, of course, was famous for a ship called the Golden Hein, which actually for a while was actually a museum ship, considered one of the first in the world. But the one you saw was a replica. There's been several replicas that have been built. What famous event occurred in England in 1588? Spain tried to invade England with the so-called attack of the Spanish Armada, which they got defeated. And what played a major role in why the English Navy defeated the Spanish Armada? Part of it was luck, but part of it was just bad weather. Bad weather and weather in their favor played a major role while the English Navy defeated the Spanish. The wind was just blowing in the right direction, apparently. And then bad storms in the English Channel, which are quite common, helped also blow the Spanish Armada in the North Sea. They ended up losing more than half their fleet. Why is 1588 considered an important year in English history? They believe it was kind of the year when England starts rising as a power, which will eventually lead to like the beginning of the British Empire. They'll start colonizing, and then Spain starts declining after that, they think. Who took over England after Elizabeth died? Of course, I just told you King James VI of Scotland. He came over, became King James I of England, what we call Great Britain afterwards. What dynasty took control of Great Britain? That, of course, is the Stewart Dynasty. So this is all kind of part of this right here. So we got King James coming in. Then I added these two other questions on the bottom. Who was William Shakespeare, or some of his greatest plays produced? William Shakespeare, of course, English playwright, poet, of course, was the greatest, playwright in, pretty much worldwide as a whole. He's famous for 38 plays. I told you the plays that were big. The big ones were Romeo and Juliet, Julius Caesar, Hamlet. Somebody's coming in? Okay. Hamlet was another one. What are the other ones I had too? Taming of the Shrew, Merchant of Venice, Richard III, Henry VIII, King Lear. I think I mentioned that one. As You Like It, The Summer Night's Dream, all kinds of plays, of course, that he produced. And of course, he had his own theater called the Globe Theater that he had. It was built in London, which there were actually two of them at one point because one of them burned down. So that's kind of a little review on that period of the Tudor period that we talked about in William Shakespeare. So I'm going to, of course, move on to talk about, of course, the latter period of this early modern England we're kind of talking about. So I am going to move on to talk about the Stewart Dynasty that takes over the British, that ruled between 1603 to 1714 that we have. You see here. Now, of course, one of the first rulers I am going to talk about that comes in is going to be King James, which I do have a picture of James to share with you right here. If you want to look at, like, also add in here the lineage of the House of Stuart, you can take a look at that also as well. Do have the emblem, of course, the coat of arms of Stuart. You can see at the top right as well with that. Yeah, I do have a picture of James I could bring up. It's a good painting of him, kind of a color painting, of course, of James the First. Like I said, James had been in power for a long time in Scotland. I believe he came to power in Scotland around 1567 after his mother, I told you, which is Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, was forced out of the country. Of course, went to England, where her half-sister Elizabeth killed her eventually. So James had been ruling since an infant. He'd been in power. Of course, Scotland went Protestant. If you know about Scotland, they adopted Presbyterianism, the so-called Presbyterian Church or Church of Scotland. So he was pretty much Protestant. And I think they say he's the one that kind of coined the name Great Britain, I told you. So like I told you, he's the first king that really rules over England and Scotland. They also rule Wales. Later, they'll also rule over Ireland as well. Those are some of the major events that happened under King James. I think King James the First and probably, I want to say, Charles II are probably the two most famous of the Stuart monarchs that you see in that list right there. I think the other one might be William. That's pretty famous as well. Yeah, William. But yeah, those are all the lineage you can see, the different rulers that exist right there. James also, of course, had a wife, of course, named Anne of Denmark, who you see there, who came in from Scandinavia and married her. He does have two children later. Of course, one became king afterwards, which is his son, Charles I, which I'll get more into today. He's the one, of course, that caused the English Civil War to break out. James was also kind of bisexual, which I'll kind of maybe get into a little later. He did kind of have some male lovers. I don't know if you know much about that, but that is kind of true about King James that they discovered. And I think there was a joke about, what was the joke about King James that they used to say sometimes? Some people thought he was a weak ruler, and maybe because of him being bisexual. They used to say that Elizabeth was king, now James is queen. That's the whole joke they used to say about it. Now, James had a lot of conflicts with Parliament. There were different reasons for this. One was spending issues was kind of a problem under King James. He liked to live lavishly, if you know about it. Give you examples. In 1621, he spent something like 336 pounds on like his budget, which is ridiculous at the time. Just like equivalent to like, I don't know how much that is now, $2 billion. I don't know what it is, how much that would be now in today's dollars, but it's probably a lot of money. So that was one conflict he had. Another conflict he had was that, if you know about the Stewart Dynasty, they were heavily influenced by the French, and they were proponents of divine right theory. And it's something that Charles, his son, Charles I, gets in a lot of trouble with. It later leads into the English Civil War, but it didn't break out under him. But it, that could happen too, I guess, if he had pushed it. But he did, on occasion, dissolve Parliament, which the monarchs could do back then. And Charles would, of course, do it again, and that, of course, caused quite a lot of conflict later with the English Civil War. Now, there are several events that were very famous under him that I wanted to talk about with, of course, the Stewart Dynasty, who I've got here. Got two different slides there, which I need to take that one out. But so here's another slide if you want on King James, and I kind of added in here for you. He did have a daughter too, by the way. I forgot, named Elizabeth of Bohemia. Forgot about her. But they had the Gunpowder Plot. I don't know if you've heard about this story, but it's basically a famous story that happened under King James. There was actually this Catholic plot to try to assassinate James. I don't know if he had a lot of conflicts with different religious groups in the country that didn't like him. They had the Puritans, which I'll get more into later, who they were. But yeah, there was this plot where Catholics, maybe involving the Jesuits, wanted to kill him off and then replace him with one of his daughters, which is Elizabeth of Bohemia, who was the daughter of him and Anne of Denmark. I think those two didn't get along, by the way. They didn't like each other. So anyway, that was the Gunpowder Plot. What happened was James was going to go do a speech at the House of Lords, and the idea was to bring in gunpowder barrels, and they were going to blow up the House of Lords and kill the king, and then hopefully put Elizabeth Stuart on the throne, who I think was I don't think she was Catholic. I think she was just maybe more sympathetic to Catholics. Because Catholics didn't really have any rights to practice their religion in the country and all that. But what happened was the plot was discovered, if you know about it, on November 5th, 1605. And so James's life was saved. They make this big deal about it later. And later, of course, they would make an anniversary out of it, where they would celebrate it every year for years. So they kind of still do. They caught a bunch of conspirators, which a bunch were hanged. The most famous you may have heard of is Guy Fawkes. He was one of the guys who was supposedly guarding the gunpowder barrels somewhere in the basement, I guess, where the House of Lords was. And so that's why they called like days of celebration that they would do every November 5th, every year afterwards, as Guy Fawkes Night, which they would take effigies of Guy Fawkes and they would burn him. Sometimes they also call it Bonfire Night as well, because they would make bonfires and set it on fire and put effigies of, I guess, of Guy Fawkes in there and all that. So it's still celebrated today. They call it Guy Fawkes Day too, I think, as well. And it's not as popular as it used to be, but it's still kind of, they still do it today. So Guy Fawkes Day. All right, so let me also talk about a few other things that James was known for as well. Yeah, he was known for colonization. That's something people forget about with King James as well. And yeah, he was known for colonizing parts of the British Empire. So really, truthfully, the British Empire really starts under him, King James. There's several colonies he founded first that were famous. The first one they founded, if you know about it, was the so-called Jamestown colony, which was founded in Virginia. It was founded by this company it was a joint stock company called the Virginia Company of London, which also founded Bermuda as well, right afterwards, I think Bermuda was founded in 1609. They were founded about the same time, roughly. And part of why the English wanted to create the Jamestown colony was they were trying to create a rival colony to the Spanish. Because the Spanish had all these colonies they had, in the New World. They were finding gold, silver, and all that. So James wanted to take advantage of that. And so eventually colonists came over in 1607. They basically founded it in eastern Virginia, close to where the James River is now, where Williamsburg is and all that, which is there still. And so that went on to become the first permanent British colony in the New World. Jamestown's going to be important later because it'll be later, one of the major 13 American colonies that will be part of the British in the, in eastern part of America today. And that's going to lead into eventually what will be part of the United States of America, which will form during the American Revolution. So that's a little later, when that happens. But that was something James was known for. Also, another thing he did too, which is not in that slide. Well, there it is right there, kind of there's it right there. But yeah, he also founded Northern Ireland. He colonized that area and brought over a lot of Scotch people to live there. You know about that, Northern Ireland, because that's why a lot of the people, if you study about Northern Ireland, they're related to a lot of the Scottish people. They call them the Scotch Irish. You may have heard that term being used. Ulster became one of its main cities. That's in there as well. And it became kind of a conflict later, between the Catholic Irish in Northern Ireland, which is mostly Protestant. It's kind of a problem they've had for years afterwards. But Northern Ireland, is now part of the so-called United Kingdom, which includes England, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales. So that's all part. But Ireland used to be part of the UK, but it's not anymore because they broke away and formed their own state. So let's kind of talk about all these things James was known for. There's one more thing. I need to talk about too, which James is very famous for. James is, of course, the one that also, founded the, pretty much created the King James Bible. Something he did, which he had a bunch of scholars in the Anglican Church develop it. Which was eventually created by 1611. So it's considered one of the first major English Bibles that was established. They had some before. Henry VIII had one he kind of developed, but it wasn't as good as this one. And so this one is the one that they still use today. I think they've kind of modified it over the years. But James kept, establishing all this stuff, he was known for. It's kind of ironic, because James was kind of like maybe bisexual, maybe homosexual. Kind of, you may have heard of the stories about this before. And the end of James's reign is marked with illness. He was very ill at the end of his reign. And he had this English nobleman that ran his court, named the Duke of Buckingham, they called him, George Villiers. And there's a theory that he may have been like one of James's lovers. They've talked about this story about it. And the Duke of Buckingham also ran his son's court, Charles I, for like the first, I think, 3 years before he died in, I want to say in 1628. So that pretty much marks, the period of, of James's reign. He is considered one of the most famous, kings, that they had, King James. Him and probably Charles II and maybe William III, I guess, in that order, of the Stuart Dynasty anyway. Right. Next, of course, I'm going to get into today. We have a few minutes left. I'm going to talk about what happens. Of course, you end up with this conflict, of course, that breaks out after James dies, which is called the English Civil War, which I'm going to get to next and talk about. This all breaks out under King Charles I's reign, who comes in. Charles I, of course, was the son, I told you, of King James I. He was the second Stuart of Great Britain, the Stewart Dynasty that rules over England, Scotland. And yeah, he does cause the English Civil War. That's one of the things he's famous for. You'll see later, he's, that king that gets his head cut off. He's executed because of the English Civil War. And he was controversial. He actually married one of the French noblewoman, Princess Henrietta Maria, who was Catholic. That was kind of controversial. Who was the daughter of Henry IV of France. Of course, Henrietta Maria, if you know about her, she was the aunt of Louis XIV. So you see, the Stuarts are kind of related to the Bourbon dynasty over there. Charles would later have two sons that were kings, Charles II and James II, brothers. And we'll talk about them later and get more into them. Now, what caused the English Civil War? Well, it's caused by different reasons. If you study about King Charles, there's a picture of King Charles you're looking at. He's kind of a runt, by the way, Charles. He was very short. I think he's only like 5'1". So maybe that's why he had a chip on his shoulder. I don't know, during this conflict. But let's talk about what caused the English Civil War to break out. They believe it was caused by not how who's in power. It wasn't anything to do with that, like who the king was, or should it be some other king, or anything like that. It had to do with how the king was ruling. And the cause of the conflict was basically whether Parliament should have all the power or King Charles should have all the power. So, like how they should rule the kingdom. And so Parliament wanted a limited monarchy, and Charles I wanted divine right. He wanted to be an absolutist, is what he wanted to do. And so this created a lot of loggerheads, between each other. You'll see later Charles even tries to abolish Parliament and all this, and it creates a big conflict between both sides. What happens is the Parliament in 1628 tries to limit his power next. They issue what they call the Petition of Right. They've got a bunch of those in there. Of course, what was going on was the king wanted to be able to raise his own revenue, like taxation himself, like maybe issue decrees or whatever. And so Parliament issued this petition, basically, and what it did was it said several things that only Parliament could basically tax, could raise revenue. So it said, people were granted, it says no taxes without consent of Parliament. So only Parliament can do it. You had to get the people's consent, to basically do it. Also, no imprisonment without trial, no quartering of soldiers, no martial law in time of peace, which some of these things he was kind of doing at the time. So his father had kind of done this before. His father had dissolved Parliament, things like that. And Charles first agreed to it, but eventually what happened, if you know about it, he broke that agreement. He eventually dismissed Parliament, is what happened. And so what happened next was he then closed down Parliament. He got rid of it. He dissolved it for like 11 years, where there was no Parliament in control of the country. And so this became known as the so-called 11 years tyranny of Charles I, the personal rule of Charles I, call it all kinds of nicknames. And so basically, if you look at it, this is the closest that the English really came to having an absolute monarch, like what's going on in Europe at the time. So, you got over there like Louis XIII, and then Louis XIV later, that you've got, they're kind of ruling as absolutists and all that. So that's basically kind of what the main conflict was that really led to later the, of course, English Civil War that would break out. And then, of course, it would come to a head eventually. By 1640, Charles needed revenue. Wasn't getting enough revenue. He was trying to collect revenue in different ways. I think there was a story where he was trying to tax all the cities for what they call ship money, which was money to raise for like harbors that were around England, etc., maybe Scotland. And he started collecting for everybody. That was one way he got money. I know it was that way. And then there was like a war that broke out, I think, in Scotland, where he needed more money. I think there was another war, I thought, against, was it France or one of those countries that broke out too, I think, as well, or France or Spain. So he needed money for also fighting wars, which he needs for his royal army. And so he recalled Parliament in 1640. Well, and I think it's like what is basically around, I think it was in May of 1640, he called what they call the short Parliament first that came into power. It lasted 3 weeks, and he shut it down again. Then he called the next Parliament a few months later, which was the long Parliament. And that one was in power for 20 years, which is why they called it that, called the long Parliament. And so that's the Parliament that's really going to cause fits for him. Those two sides, won't agree on anything over power and money. And eventually it came to a head January 1642. You could see Charles eventually tried to send troops into Parliament to basically seize a few members that were in there that were a threat to him, he thought, for treason. I think it was mostly members that were Puritans. Puritans were these Anglican members of that church that wanted to purify the church of any kind of Catholicism that was in it. And I'll get to Oliver Cromwell later. He was one of the examples of some of these members of Parliament that he wanted to get rid of. And what happened was it caused so much conflict between the two sides that civil war broke out between Parliament versus the royalist side, the king's side. Mob violence literally broke out in London, and he was actually forced, he and his family fled to northern England. And so that started what is basically the English Civil War that'll follow. And the English Civil War was not really, it wasn't really one war. It was actually 3 wars. It was actually a series of 3 wars that broke out, which really start 1642, and I guess all 3 of them go up to about 1651. And so they had the first English Civil War, second English Civil War, and the third English Civil War. And in the UK today, they still call it the War of the 3 Kingdoms. They call it this because of the fact that it involved England, Scotland, and Ireland. We're all kind of fighting at one point and basically fought against, Charles, and eventually you're going to see later that England's going to divide into 2 opposing camps, which I'll get to later. And we'll talk about what happens to Charles. He gets executed. And for a while, they do abolish the actual monarchy, which is kind of interesting about that, how they do that. So I'll talk about that later. I think I'm going to stop here pretty much on the English Civil War, because I'm not going to be able to finish it all today, because I might show a video too later next week on that. But pretty much that's it for today. Before we go, I do want you to remind you a few things about, I guess, some major events that are important coming up. Don't forget, of course, about the, let me bring it up here, but remind you about the, of course, assignments you got due coming up. So you got the first exam. That, of course, is due tonight. So don't forget about that. Told you that's going to expire tonight. I did push it back 2 days. That's still open. Also, there is a video quiz I told you about, which is on Sir Isaac Newton. That's still up. Of course, so get that finished. Try to get that this week done by the weekend. And I did put a new Canvas quiz up, which is mostly on the scientific revolution in the Age of Enlightenment. So you got a lot to do, you know, all that. And so try to get that done, as soon as possible. And also, I want to remind you about something too coming up probably next week. But I am going to probably have some kind of announcement about makeups coming up. I think like in the usually midterms, I usually have a makeup period. So I am going to have a makeup period coming up for you to make up assignments you've missed. It won't include the first exam, so you need to get that done, but it will include like maybe vocab you may have not turned in or quiz you may have not done. But I will be sending out announcements about that next week, about that issue. So that's it for today. Also remind you, if you have any questions too about this lecture was kind of fuzzy today with the green screen messed up today, but I'll try to fix that next time. But yeah, if you have any questions about this lecture, I am going to put it up on my YouTube channel later. And if so, just send me some comments, questions about that. So that's about it for today. Hope you're having a good morning and week this week, but that's pretty much it for today. Hope y'all have a good weekend coming up. And that's it. I'll see y'all next Tuesday when I put up another lecture. So that's it for today. So take care.